Today, I'm taking you on a journey through 15 traditional British Christmas puddings, some you've never heard of, and some that have been beloved for centuries. Stick around because number one on this list is an absolute showstopper you won't want to miss. From the humble plum pottages of medieval kitchens to the rich, boozy recipes of Victorian families and royal dining tables, each pudding tells a story. Some were simple creations for working class homes, while others were symbols of wealth and celebration. Hidden coins, secret ingredients, and centuries old rituals made these desserts more than just food. They were pieces of history you could taste. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our nostalgic food journeys. 1. Medieval plum pottage. Before Christmas pudding became a dense, sweetened dessert, it started as something far more humble. Medieval cooks called it plum pottage, and it wasn't a pudding at all. It was a thick, savory sweet stew served in wooden bowls during the coldest weeks of winter. The dish set the foundation for everything the pudding would become, even though it looked nothing like the glossy domes we know today. Plum pottage grew out of necessity. Winters were long and food preservation mattered more than flavor. Households boiled chopped beef or mutton with onions, wine, dried fruits, and a heavy mix of warming spices. In a time when sugar was rare and expensive, spices like cinnamon and clove acted as both seasoning and medicine. They warmed the body, masked the taste of aging meat, and created a holiday fragrance that became tied to midwinter feasts. The dish was often made in large cauldrons that simmered for hours, filling entire halls with steam. It wasn't just a meal. For many families, plum pottage marked the start of Christmas celebrations. When the pot finally hit the long wooden tables, it meant the harvest was tucked away, the cold had settled in, and people could gather indoors to rest for a moment. That sense of warmth, of turning scarcity into celebration, is why plum pottage mattered. It held everything people hope for in winter: comfort, preservation, and the chance to eat something hearty before supplies thinned. What surprises most people today is how different the flavors were from the modern pudding. It wasn't dessert in the modern sense. It was closer to a medieval chili mixed with fruitcake. The combination of beef, prunes, spices, and ale created a dish that was sweet, salty, tangy, and savory all at once. To a modern palate, it would be startling. Yet for families who lived with long nights and cold rooms, it was luxury. Plum pottage eventually faded as cooking methods changed and sugar became easier to find. But without this heavy stew, there would be no Christmas pudding. The idea of mixing meat, fruit, spice, and alcohol stayed in the recipe for centuries. Each generation changed the texture a little more, slowly moving the dish from the stew pot to the pudding cloth. As we shift forward in time, the next step in the pudding's evolution brought even more sweetness, a firmer shape, and a recipe that finally started to resemble the treat we recognize today. The first boiled figgy pudding. By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, plum pottage had begun to change. Families across Britain were moving away from the stew pot and experimenting with something more solid, something that could be tied in a cloth and boiled. This shift gave birth to one of the earliest true Christmas puddings, boiled figgy pudding. The idea was simple but transformative. Instead of simmering meat and fruit together in a cauldron, cooks began mixing dried figs, breadcrumbs, ale, eggs, and suet into a thick batter. They spooned it into a pudding cloth, tied it tight, and lowered it into a pot of boiling water. After several hours, the bundle came out firm, fragrant, and shaped like a round stone. It was the first time the pudding had a defined form, and it opened the door to the dessert we know today. Figgy pudding mattered because it introduced structure. Families could slice it, store it, and even carry it. Dried figs were easier to find than plums in many regions, and suet gave the pudding a rich texture that stayed moist for days. Ale added flavor and sweetness at a time when sugar was still expensive. In many homes, making figgy pudding became a point of pride. It showed that a family had access to ingredients that weren't always easy to obtain. Another reason this pudding became popular was its role in community celebrations. Figgy pudding showed up at feasts, fairs, and church gatherings. It was hearty enough to serve a crowd, and it traveled well in the cold. The rhythm of households boiling puddings before Christmas became a sign that the season was near. Even the smell carried meaning. When figs, ale, and spices mixed with steam rising from the pot, it signaled comfort during a dark time of year. What catches people off guard today is the flavor. Early figgy pudding wasn't the sweet dessert many picture when they hear the name. It was mildly sweet, but the ale and suet gave it a savory edge. The pudding sat somewhere between bread and fruitcake, with a dense texture that felt closer to survival food than a festive indulgence. Yet people loved it. It was dependable, filling, and celebratory in a world where winter offered few luxuries. Over time, figs gave way to raisins, currants, and other dried fruits as trade expanded and ingredients traveled more easily. But figgy pudding left a lasting mark. It proved that the Christmas pudding could evolve, adapt, and take on new forms while keeping its roots in warmth and preservation. As we move forward, the dish becomes even richer and begins to carry the rituals and symbolism we now associate with the holiday season. Number 3, Georgian Twelfth Night Pudding. By the time Britain entered the Georgian era, Christmas pudding had taken on a new life. The old figgy mixtures were still around, but a grander, richer version appeared on tables during Twelfth Night celebrations. This was a time when Christmas stretched far beyond December 25th, ending with a lively feast on January 5th. Families marked the close of the season with a pudding that was thick, sweet, and heavily spiced. It was a symbol of prosperity at a moment when winter felt its darkest. Georgian cooks loved extravagance. Sugar had become easier to import, and so had dried fruits from the colonies. Households began folding raisins, currants, candied peel, and brandy into the pudding mix. Spices were used freely. Nutmeg, mace, ginger, and cinnamon filled kitchens with warm scents that cut through frost creeping at the windows. The pudding was still boiled, still tied in cloth, but its flavor grew deeper and its texture more indulgent. This was no longer a working class winter staple. It was a centerpiece. Twelfth Night pudding mattered because it represented much more than dessert. It marked the end of nearly 2 weeks of rest, games, and gatherings. Many people spent the season visiting neighbors, sharing food, and taking a break from the year's labor. The pudding arrived at the moment the holiday faded and normal life returned. Cutting into it felt like a final toast to warmth before winter carried on. There was another layer to this pudding: mischief. Twelfth Night traditions often included hidden tokens baked into the mixture. A bean and a pea were the most common pair. Whoever found them became the evening's king and queen. They wore paper crowns, commanded playful orders, and kept the room laughing. The night blurred class lines for a few hours. A servant could become the mock king. A child could boss around an adult. The pudding offered a little rebellion wrapped in tradition. The surprising twist is how controversial these celebrations became. As the 18th century moved forward, some groups viewed Twelfth Night festivities as wasteful or unruly. Critics complained that the rich puddings and lively parties encouraged too much drinking and too little discipline. Debates rose about whether these holiday customs should continue. Yet the pudding survived. Even when certain traditions faded, families held on to the recipe. This Georgian version shaped what Christmas pudding would eventually become. It introduced the idea that the dish wasn't just food, but ceremony. It carried sweetness, symbolism, and a hint of revelry. And as sugar grew more affordable, the pudding's flavor grew even richer. 4. Victorian stir-up Sunday ritual. By the 19th century, Christmas pudding had become more than a recipe. It had turned into a ritual. No moment captured this better than Stir-Up Sunday, the last Sunday before Advent, when families gathered to mix the pudding batter for Christmas Day. Victorian households treated it as both a duty and a celebration. It was the day the season quietly announced itself. Stir-Up Sunday began with a line from the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer. The service for that day opened with the words, "Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord." Congregations heard the phrase, walked home, and headed straight for the mixing bowl. Over time, the religious message merged with the kitchen task, and the name stuck. For many families, the sound of spoons scraping against ceramic bowls felt as traditional as any carol. What made this ritual matter wasn't just the mixing, it was the gathering. Each person in the household took a turn stirring the thick, heavy batter. Children, parents, grandparents, and anyone else who happened to be visiting added their own circle of movement to the bowl. The mixture was stiff, loaded with raisins, currants, spices, sugar, suet, and dark treacle. So stirring it took effort. Everyone who helped made a wish. Why some wished for good health, others for good harvests, and some for simple luck in the coming year. The direction mattered too. Victorians insisted the batter be stirred from east to west in honor of the journey of the Magi. Even families who weren't strictly religious kept the custom because it tied the pudding to a sense of shared memory. It made the recipe feel older than any ingredient. There was also a softer layer to this tradition. Stir Up Sunday happened when daylight grew short and coal fires burned longer. Kitchens were crowded spaces where warmth collected. People stood shoulder to shoulder, passing spoons, laughing at the strain of stirring and dusting raisins off aprons. It gave the season an early flicker of joy. Even families with modest means could take part because the ingredients were more accessible than they had been in earlier centuries. The emotional twist often came after the mixing. The batter went into a pudding basin, tightly wrapped and steamed for hours. The room filled with the scent of spices and dark sugars. Once cooled, the pudding was stored and left to mature until Christmas. That waiting period gave the dish a sense of patience. Families knew that while they went about their daily lives, the pudding was quietly improving in the pantry. Stir Up Sunday connected generations. It preserved the idea that Christmas pudding was something you earned with time and togetherness. The suet debate. As Christmas pudding settled into its Victorian form, one ingredient stood at the center of countless kitchen arguments: suet. Real beef suet, taken from the fat around a cow's kidneys, gave the pudding its signature richness. It melted slowly during steaming, leaving behind a tender, moist texture that butter or oil couldn't quite match. But not everyone agreed it belonged in the bowl. This dispute became one of the most talked about parts of the recipe, especially among home cooks who guarded their traditions closely. For many families, suet wasn't optional. It was the soul of the pudding. Butchers sold it in small, fresh blocks, and cooks spent time chopping it finely so it blended evenly with the fruit and breadcrumbs. Suet added structure. It helped the pudding hold its shape and kept it from drying out during long cooking times. The flavor was subtle but noticeable. People who grew up with it claimed nothing else tasted like Christmas. Others felt differently. By the late 19th century, butter had become more common in home kitchens, and new cookbooks suggested using it instead of suet. This sparked the debate. Some argued butter made the pudding lighter and more refined. Others insisted it made the texture greasy. Families stood firmly on their chosen side. Even in small villages, neighbors would compare puddings and defend their ingredient choices with surprising energy. Why this mattered goes deeper than a single ingredient. Suet reflected the resourcefulness of earlier centuries when every part of an animal was used. Keeping suet in the recipe kept the dish tied to its roots. Butter represented a shift toward modern comforts and changing tastes. Choosing one over the other became a small statement about identity, class, and values in the kitchen. The emotional twist appears in the memories people carried. Many adults looked back on childhood Christmases and remembered helping prepare suet, softening it near the fire, chopping it carefully, and working it into the batter by hand. It was a step that took time. It made the pudding feel earned. When later generations switched to butter or vegetable shortening, some felt the tradition had lost a piece of its character. Others felt relieved to leave behind the mess and effort. What surprises people today is how strongly families once felt about this. Cookbook margins were filled with notes, corrections, and reminders about the proper fat. Holiday gatherings often included quiet judging of whose pudding texture turned out best. The debate became part of the story, a reminder that recipes are more than instructions. They're tied to memories, habits, and pride. As we move ahead, the pudding takes another turn. Sugar and imported fruit reshape the recipe again, and the dish becomes a symbol of wealth as much as celebration. Number 6, the rise of the rich man's pudding. As the 19th century moved forward, Christmas pudding became more than a family tradition. It turned into a showpiece. This was the era when Britain's global trade network brought in sugar, spices, dried fruits, and alcohol on a scale households had never seen before. With greater access came greater ambition. Families who could afford it began transforming the humble pudding into a symbol of status. This shift created what many called the rich man's pudding. The foundation stayed familiar: suet, flour, breadcrumbs, and dried fruit. But the quantities changed. Instead of a handful of raisins, cooks added entire pounds. Candied peel, imported from the Mediterranean, appeared in bright, fragrant strips. Almonds were chopped and stirred in. Dark treacle deepened the color and added moisture. Brandy wasn't just for soaking the fruit, it went directly into the batter. Some wealthier households even added orange blossom water, a detail that surprised visitors and hinted at expensive tastes. This version of the pudding mattered because it captured the changing spirit of Victorian Britain. Many households measured their prosperity in small but meaningful ways, and holiday cooking became one of them. A pudding packed with costly ingredients stood as proof that the family had done well that year. It wasn't bragging, it was tradition. People believed that the holiday table should reflect gratitude and abundance. The pudding also carried emotional weight during a time of stark inequality. Wealthy families enjoyed glittering Christmas feasts, complete with polished silver and elaborate courses. Meanwhile, the working class relied on simpler meals and sometimes went without. The rich man's pudding wasn't just a recipe, it was a reminder of the gap between families who could afford imported luxuries and those who depended on local ingredients. This contrast shaped how people talked about Christmas traditions for generations. There was a surprising twist at many Victorian tables. Guests often compared puddings quietly, noticing how much fruit was inside or how dark the batter looked. Cooks took pride in creating the heaviest mixture possible. Some households even weighed their puddings, believing that a hefty one showed the cook's skill and the family's prosperity. What we see today as a nostalgic dessert once carried a layer of gentle competition. Over time, this richer style of pudding became the standard. Even families of modest means tried to imitate it, stretching their budgets to add an extra handful of currants or a splash more brandy. The recipe had shifted permanently towards sweetness and indulgence. The pudding was no longer just winter fuel, it had become a holiday centerpiece. As we move forward, the story takes a different turn. Not every family could afford such luxury. Some households created their own version that was simpler, humbler, and just as meaningful. Nabjmer 7, the poor man's holiday pud. While wealthy Victorian families poured sugar, brandy, and mountains of dried fruit into their Christmas puddings, many households across Britain worked with much less. Their version went by a simple name, the poor man's holiday pud. It didn't shine on the table or arrive with fancy ingredients, but it carried its own kind of pride. For families with limited means, this pudding was proof that Christmas could still be celebrated, even when money was tight. The base of the poor man's pudding relied on what the kitchen already had. Breadcrumbs replaced flour. Small amounts of suet were stretched with grated carrot or grated potato to add moisture. Raisins were precious, so many cooks used only a handful or substituted with apples, prunes, or whatever dried fruit they could spare. Sugar was used sparingly, often cut with black treacle to deepen the flavor. If alcohol made it into the batter, it was usually a splash of whatever bottle happened to be open. What made this pudding matter was not extravagance, but determination. These families refused to let the season pass without marking it somehow. Even a modest pudding felt like an achievement because it required saving, planning, and a bit of sacrifice. Children helped collect breadcrumbs and measure ingredients. Mothers spent days setting aside small additions until there was enough to make the mix. The final bowl represented teamwork more than wealth. The emotional twist lies in how the pudding was treated at the table. In homes where money was scarce, this dish often stood at the center of Christmas dinner. People sliced it carefully, mindful that every piece mattered. Rather than being compared to richer versions, it was appreciated for what it was: a small, warm reward at the end of a long, cold year. It carried the flavor of effort, not luxury. Even the cooking process reflected this spirit. Long steaming times burned more fuel than many families could justify, so some households boiled their puddings quickly or cooked them in the corner of the hearth while working on other meals. The result was sometimes uneven or crumbly, but no one complained. The pudding was a symbol of celebration, and that made it enough. There's a surprising detail about these simpler puddings. Many historians note that the flavor was often brighter and earthier than the heavier, richer versions. Carrot added sweetness. apple added moisture, treacle gave it depth. Even without the expensive ingredients, the pudding could still be deeply satisfying. The poor man's pudding holds an important place in the story because it shows how traditions survive when people adapt. Christmas wasn't only for the wealthy, it was for every home that found a way to mark the day with whatever they had. From here, the story shifts to a custom shared by every class, rich or poor. Number 8. The Christmas Sixpence. For generations, Christmas pudding carried a small secret hidden deep inside its dark, sticky center: a silver sixpence. This tiny coin turned an ordinary slice of pudding into a moment of excitement. Whether the household was wealthy or struggling, the sixpence brought a spark of luck to the table. It wasn't just a superstition, it was a tradition that blended fortune, family, and a little harmless suspense. The custom began in the Victorian era, though it was inspired by older practices of hiding charms in cakes and breads during festive seasons. Cooks slipped the sixpence into the pudding mixture before steaming, making sure it stayed somewhere near the middle. When the pudding was finally sliced on Christmas Day, everyone watched their plate with a mix of hope and caution. Finding the coin meant good fortune for the coming year. Some families believed it promised wealth. Others said it guaranteed good health or future opportunities. Whatever the meaning, the coin carried a sense of possibility. What made this tradition matter is how it brought families together. No matter their circumstances, everyone shared the same feeling as the pudding was served. Children sat up straighter, adults exchanged knowing glances. People laughed when someone poked at their slice with a spoon before taking a bite. The sixpence turned dessert into a small event, one that added anticipation to a day already full of meaning. There was also an emotional twist to this custom. Parents often made quiet efforts to guide the coin toward a particular child or guest. They wanted someone who needed a bit of encouragement to be the one who found it: a child who had struggled that year, a parent who had worked tirelessly, a visitor who felt far from home. When that person lifted their fork and heard the soft clink of metal on porcelain, the table lit up. The moment felt planned, but it also felt perfect. It gave the pudding a purpose beyond flavor. The practice came with its share of surprises too. Families sometimes hid more than just a sixpence. Rings symbolized future marriages. Buttons hinted at bachelorhood. Thimbles suggested industriousness. Each charm carried a message, and each message became part of the laughter around the table. But the sixpence remained the most treasured symbol, partly because it was simple and partly because it represented a small piece of real value. In later years, as currency changed and safety became a concern, the sixpence tradition faded in many homes. Modern puddings often include decorative tokens placed on top rather than hidden inside. 9. A royal seal of approval. Christmas pudding may have begun as a humble winter dish, but it stepped firmly into the spotlight when it won the attention of the British royal family. The monarchy didn't invent the recipe, but their endorsements helped turn it into a national symbol. When a tradition earns the approval of a king or queen, it tends to stick. That's exactly what happened during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Christmas pudding shifted from a household favorite to a patriotic staple. The first major influence came from Queen Victoria. She and Prince Albert were known for embracing Christmas customs and bringing new ones into the spotlight. Albert, with his German background, loved holiday rituals. The royal household served a grand Christmas pudding every year, made with rich fruits, spices, and generous amounts of alcohol. When newspapers described the royal Christmas table, the pudding received special mention. It didn't take long for families across Britain to imitate the style. If the Queen enjoyed it, then it must be the proper way. But the pudding's royal story grew even stronger during the reign of George V. In 1927, he supported the creation of the Empire Christmas pudding, a recipe designed to include ingredients from across the British Empire. Raisins from Australia, spices from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and brandy from South Africa all came together in one bowl. The message was clear. The pudding wasn't just dessert, it was a way to celebrate unity across distant lands. Newspapers encouraged families to adopt the recipe, and many did. It turned a familiar dish into a symbol of connection, even if the ingredients were difficult for some households to afford. What makes this chapter matter is how much influence the monarchy had on everyday kitchens. People copied not only the ingredients, but the presentation. Serving a pudding that looked royal felt like participating in something grand. It gave the holiday table a sense of ceremony. Even families who lived modestly tried to add at least one special ingredient that echoed the royal version. The emotional twist came during the years of war and rationing. As ingredients became scarce, the public wondered whether the pudding tradition would survive. Then came a reassuring gesture. Royal households continued to serve Christmas pudding, even if it was simpler than before. The message encouraged families to hold on to the ritual in their own way. The monarchy's commitment kept the pudding alive at a time when many traditions were slipping away. The royal connection didn't make the pudding fancy, it made it shared. It tied together households of every background and reminded people that certain traditions were worth keeping. From here, the story moves into one of the most meaningful changes the pudding ever underwent. Number 10, wartime ration pudding. When the Second World War arrived, Christmas pudding faced a challenge it had never seen before. Ingredients that once symbolized abundance, sugar, dried fruit, suet, and brandy, were suddenly scarce. Yet, even in the darkest years, families refused to abandon the tradition. From London flats to rural cottages, the Christmas pudding adapted to rationing, proving that the spirit of the holiday could survive even the harshest circumstances. The ration pudding was a study in ingenuity. Cooks learned to stretch limited resources, substituting grated carrots, mashed potatoes, or breadcrumbs for suet. Candied peel was replaced by chopped prunes, and sugar was used sparingly, often cut with treacle or syrup to maintain sweetness. A splash of rum or brandy, if available, became a treasured luxury rather than a routine addition. Families discovered that with careful preparation, the pudding still steamed into a fragrant, dark, rich dessert, even without the full list of pre-war luxuries. Why this version mattered is easy to understand. Christmas during wartime was often grim. Families were separated by service, cities were under blackout, and uncertainty loomed over the future. The pudding became more than food. It became a touchstone, a piece of normalcy in an otherwise disrupted world. Making it required effort, but that effort brought hope. The act of stirring, wrapping, and steaming the batter reminded families that some traditions could endure. There was also an emotional twist built into every bite. Some households included small items in the pudding, much like the pre-war sixpence, though often homemade charms replaced coins. Letters from soldiers overseas described receiving puddings from loved ones. Even in the bleakest moments, the dessert carried messages of connection, love, and resilience. Soldiers described the smell of spices and treacle as a taste of home, a fleeting but profound comfort amid chaos. The surprising detail is how creative cooks became. Recipes that would have been dismissed as unconventional before the war were celebrated out of necessity. Carrots, parsnips, and even leftover dried bread became key ingredients. Treacle, which might have seemed too dark or heavy, transformed into a flavorful backbone. Each pudding told a story of resourcefulness and care, reflecting the challenges of daily life rather than indulgence. By the end of the war, the ration pudding had secured its place in the history of Christmas desserts. It proved that the essence of the pudding wasn't just richness or sweetness, it was family, ritual, and the joy of marking a season together, even when circumstances were difficult. Next, the story deepens into one of the pudding's most distinctive features, the secret of black treacle. From medieval plum pottages to luxurious brandy-soaked Victorian classics, Christmas pudding has always been more than just dessert. It's tradition, memory, and a symbol of togetherness. Each pudding we explored today tells a story of creativity, resilience, and festive joy. Whether it was a humble ration time pudding or the ultimate showpiece served on a royal table, these recipes remind us that the heart of Christmas is in sharing, stirring, and savoring. If you enjoyed this journey, hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another dive into nostalgic recipes and forgotten foods. Share your own Christmas pudding memories in the comments. We'd love to hear which recipe is your favorite.